So around 18 months ago, I got to review the original AK70, but never really got around to doing one for the second generation. Then a couple of weeks ago, Astell and Kern announced two new additions to their lineup in the form of the AN Futura and the AN Norma, with the AN Norma said to be a direct replacement for the AK70 Mark II. So I decided that before I get to review the AN Norma, it would be a good idea to reacquaint myself with what it is that Astell and Kern does, and in particular with regards to the AK70 Mark II. Okay, so people who haven't really shown any interest in this little portable audio world are unlikely to recognize the Astell and Kern name. But if you've been in this for even just a few short weeks or months, I'm pretty confident that you'll be quite familiar with the name. Astell and Kern makes some of the most interesting looking devices out there. They've always got some strange design element such as sharp angles or offset displays. But even though the designs are incredibly unconventional, somehow Astell and Kern always manage to pull it off like absolute pros. They're kind of like the equivalent of Vacheron Constantin. Their designs are so iconic that even manufacturers like FIO have, to not really say stolen per se, but rather borrowed some of the design elements. We can really see this on the X5 3rd Gen and X7 Mark II. Those extra edges and sharp angles serve absolutely no purpose other than an aesthetic one, and that's pretty much what Astell and Kern's devices are so famous for. In the case of the AK70 Mark II, we get a much more conservative design compared to Astell and Kern's higher priced products. It's still an unconventional look with that off-center display, but it's not quite as intriguing as, say for example, the AK240 or AK300 series. For the most part, the AK70 Mark II is almost identical to the original AK70, with the only differences being in the design of the knurling on the volume dial, a color scheme change, and the body is also 2.5mm wider and 2.2mm thicker. It has also picked up a little bit of weight, coming in at 150 grams versus the 132 grams of the original. But overall, they're pretty much the same device in terms of the design. On the right hand side of the device, we get a rather large volume dial. Now, at first glance, you might mistake this for being a slightly stiff analog volume pot, like you would see on retro amplifiers, but instead, it does have some distinct clicks when turning it, which means that it is a digital control. Compared to what I remember from the original AK70, these clicks don't feel as loose and plasticky on the Mark II. But unfortunately, there is still some play with this part, just like I experienced with the original. It's a shame really, as the rest of the device looks and feels so solid and as though it's got the tolerances of a Swiss watch. I won't say that it feels like a weak point that will give in on you in just a few months, but at this price I expect better build quality. Along the bottom is where we find the micro USB charging and data port. And yes, the device does support both being used as an external sound card for your Mac and PC, as well as being able to output the digital audio through the micro USB port to an external DAC device. There's also support for external storage devices over OTG. On the left side is the single micro SD card slot, and towards the upper portion are the skip and play pause buttons. The top edge houses the 3.5mm unbalanced output and 2.5mm balanced output, as well as the power button. As you might expect, the rear doesn't have anything that serves a particular function, but we do get another taste of Astell and Kern's design language in the form of this really interesting pattern on a dark bluish grey color, accompanied with a mirror silver Astell and Kern logo, all of which is underneath a layer of glass. Overall, the device has an interesting design and something that is quite different from the majority of portable players out there, even if that design is very conservative by Astell and Kern's standards. Now, under the hood lies a pair of Cirrus Logic 4398 DAC chips, whereas the original AK70 had to make do with only a single chip of what appears to be the same model. This improved circuitry has, in part, resulted in a roughly 3% better signal-to-noise ratio, a 4% improvement in crosstalk, and the total harmonic distortion figures are also down to 0.0005% from 0.0008%. Clock jitter has also been improved, which now sits at 45 picoseconds as opposed to the 50 picoseconds jitter of the original AK70. Now, the UI is something that absolutely must be mentioned here. Of all the portable players that I've used or reviewed, except maybe the Apple iPod Touch, Astell and Kern's software and UI are as close to perfection as I've ever experienced. They haven't really gone for anything over the top or otherwise fancy, but with reference to the design and layout, there's just an inherent beauty with the minimalist simplicity of the UI. Even though the device is running some sort of Android, it doesn't look anything like Android. There's no bloat or anything otherwise that would be unnecessary. This is a dedicated music player, and the software gives you exactly that. Nothing that's not related to a music player. So starting off from the home screen, we can immediately start browsing through our music via artists and album tags, genres or playlists, as well as directly browsing through the internal and external storage via a file browser. There's also the option to go to the Astell and Kern store, which isn't anything more than really where you'd get access to some streaming services such as Tidal. Now that's something else to mention actually. The AK70 Mark II does have built-in Wi-Fi. Of course, you wouldn't be able to utilize any streaming services if you don't have access to the internet. But because the software is such an extremely slimmed and trimmed version of Android, you can't just go ahead and install any third-party apps that you'd like. Here, you're entirely at the mercy of what Astell and Kern provides in their little store, and your choices aren't much. If we look at the UI of the actual music player app, we again see this very minimalist but refined design. Again, there's nothing more than what you'd need, and it's all laid out in a very intuitive and friendly manner. When I reviewed the FiiO M7 a few weeks back, I mentioned that I felt that the UI on it followed a very similar design principle as what I found on Astell and Kern's players. And now being able to review another Astell and Kern product, I can confirm that this still rings true for me. FiiO still has a bit of a way to go, but they've done a great job so far. And for whatever reason, Astell and Kern don't seem to publish any sort of battery life figures for their devices. Of course, the battery life does depend on numerous things, such as the volume level, the file type, the sampling rate, the screen on time, and a couple of other factors. But at least just some indication would be useful. So I went ahead and did my usual battery life test, which I do for every device, and the AK70 Mark II managed to play the 96 kHz 24-bit album into the Pinnacle P1 for almost exactly 9 hours non-stop. That's pretty much on par with competing devices. Now onto the sound. The sound is another area where Astell and Kern do very well, and as they should, given these types of products. But the fact is that you do pay a lot more for these products compared to offerings from the likes of FiiO and Shanling, for example. Overall, I would describe the sound signature as pretty neutral with a touch of warmth. The AK70 Mark II is more than capable of retrieving the finer details and presenting them to you in a very enjoyable manner. On its own, as a standalone player, it's a very competent device, and it's easy to see how this could very well be a person's go-to device of choice in terms of portability. But I find it's always useful to directly compare the sound of a product to something that I know is an excellent performer, and so I pull out my trusty IDSD Black Label for this. I've got to say, Astell and Kern did a great job with the AK70 Mark II. When I directly compare it to the IDSD, I definitely can appreciate the additional refinement in the sound of the iFi, but it's still surprising to see how well the AK70 Mark II can handle itself against something like this, a dedicated DAC device. Let's start off with the bass region, and in particular how strong drum beats are presented. The iFi shows more authority here, giving you more of a presence and punch. In contrast, the AK70 has more of a snap to the actual hit of the drums, which makes those sounds come across as less engaging. What I'm hearing here is that the Astell and Kern lacks just a bit of smoothness and finesse. It just feels as though the AK is trying harder, whereas the IDSD has this effortlessly smooth character. That effortlessness is, in my opinion at least, what I would describe as being indicative of a device's refinement in audio presentation. So how does that relate more directly to the actual instrument sounds? Well, I'd say that it comes down to a sense of realism. As I mentioned, the AK doesn't quite have the ability to portray that punchiness of the drums, and likewise with acoustic guitars, you don't quite get that same portrayal of the resonance that emanates from the guitar body. There is just one area where I found myself drawn a bit more to the sound of the AK70, and that's with certain piano notes. Every now and then, there was just this certain crispness to the notes that I enjoyed. How that translates into the objective accuracy of the notes is not something I could answer, but it was a little detail that stood out to me. Overall, I don't consider the AK70 Mark II as something which could sonically replace my IDSD, but again, as a standalone device, the AK70 Mark II is a really good performer. There should be a little sound demo video that will be posted shortly after this review video is posted, so keep an eye out for that. Now, where do things stand when we start to consider the outright value packed into the AK70 Mark II? What do we get? Relatively speaking, it's a fairly compact device, at least more so than the X5 3rd Gen and X7 Mark II from FiiO. Then there's also the software to consider, and this is a major point for me personally. I can't stand shoddy software, especially when bugs are blatantly obvious. When such bugs exist, that says to me that the manufacturer is lazy and takes very little pride in what they create. With Astell and Kern, I've never felt that way. Things are polished and refined, but perhaps more importantly, and this may seem like a bit of a weird thing to say, but things just work the way they are advertised to. If you're at all familiar with the likes of FiiO, then I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. Often FiiO will advertise features or functionality for their devices, and then only afterwards do you realize that particular features or functions are only intended to be included in subsequent firmware upgrades. This is becoming less of an issue with them, but it still creeps up from time to time. With Astell and Kern, you don't have that issue to worry about, and that is in part what you're paying for. Unfortunately, we don't get extras such as an optical output or dual card slots, and at this price, those are features that I feel really should be included, but it all comes down to compromises. For roughly the same price, especially now that the AN Norma is replacing the AK70 Mark II, you could get this AK70 or the flagship FiiO X7 Mark II. The FiiO gives you way more features, but at the same time, you'd have to deal with FiiO's software. As far as the sound quality is concerned, I don't honestly know if there's such a relatively big gap between those two devices, but I'd have to compare them directly in order to really say anything more concrete than that. In conclusion, the AK70 Mark II is somewhat of a pricey device, but it is also a very complete device. It feels reliable and dependent, and when you hold and use the device, you get a real sense of it being a quality designed and constructed device. And therein lies the true value of the AK70 Mark II. Thanks for watching. That's all from me for now, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.